The rain didn't just fall in the heights, it drowned the secrets of the city in a cold, metallic gray. It was the kind of downpour that turned the asphalt into a mirror and the air into a thick, suffocating curtain of mist. I had lived in this neighborhood for 2 years, tucked away in a small apartment that smelled of lavender and old books, a quiet sanctuary from a world that had always felt a little too loud, a little too sharp. Usually, the only sounds at 1 a.m. were the rhythmic drumming of water on my windowpane and the distant hum of the city. But tonight, the rhythm was broken. A heavy thud echoed from the alleyway just below my porch, followed by a sound I had only ever heard in movies, the frantic, dying wail of a police siren, cut short as the cruiser sped past onto the main boulevard. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. I shouldn't have looked. I should have stayed in the kitchen, sipping my tea and wearing the oversized cream sweater that made me feel safe. But the silence that followed the siren was heavier than the rain, and curiosity, or perhaps some misplaced sense of mercy, pulled me toward the back door. I stepped onto the wet wood of the porch, the cold air biting through my clothes. There, slumped against a stack of discarded pallets, was a man. Even in the shadows, he looked like a predator that had finally been cornered. He was tall, his powerful build barely contained by a black leather jacket that gleamed under the dim amber glow of the street lamp. His white shirt was torn open, the fabric no longer white but a deep, sickening crimson that bloomed across his chest like a dark flower. A heavy gold chain caught the light as his chest heaved with shallow, ragged breaths. I should have called the police. I should have run inside and locked the door. But then he lifted his head, and I froze. His eyes were cold, sharp, and unbroken, even as he pressed a trembling hand against a wound that looked like it had been carved by a bullet. He didn't look like a victim, he looked like a king who had been betrayed. I requested no witnesses, he rasped, his voice a low, dangerous growl that sent a shiver down my spine. It was smooth like aged whiskey but jagged with pain. The sirens were coming back, louder this time, the blue and red lights beginning to dance against the brick walls of the alley. If they found him here, he was dead. If they found me with him, my quiet life was over. I looked at the blood on the ground, then at the raw power in his gaze. "I'm Lily," I whispered, my voice trembling as much as my hands. "And I'm the only one who can hide you before they turn that corner." I stepped down into the rain, letting the door fall shut behind me, and reached out to the man who would destroy my world by morning. If this story pulled you in for even a second, kindly support me with likes, comments and also subscribe. It means the world to me. The transition from the rain-soaked alley to the sterile silence of my kitchen was a blur of heavy footfalls and muffled groans. Rico moved with a lethal grace that even a bullet to the ribs couldn't fully extinguish. I guided him to my small wooden table, the one where I usually spent my mornings reading in the sun. Now, it was draped in white towels that were quickly turning a terrifying shade of crimson. "Sit," I whispered, though it felt less like a command and more like a plea. He dropped into the chair, the leather of his jacket creaking as he leaned back. His breathing was a harsh, rhythmic rasp that seemed to fill every corner of the room. As I reached out to peel back the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt, his hand shot out, catching my wrist. His grip was like iron, hot and dry. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I looked up and found myself pinned by his gaze. His eyes weren't just cold, they were predatory, an ice blue that seemed to see through the innocent life I had carefully constructed for myself. Even wounded, even bleeding out on my floor, he radiated a terrifying sense of authority. "I need to see the wound, Rico," I said, surprised by the sudden steadiness in my own voice. "You're losing too much blood." He searched my face for a long second, looking for a flinch or a hint of betrayal. Finding none, he slowly uncurled his fingers. I didn't waste another moment. I cut away the expensive silk of his shirt, exposing a jagged hole just below his ribs. The sight made my stomach flip, but the nurse's instinct I had buried years ago took over. I worked in a focused silence, cleaning the area with antiseptic that made him hiss through clenched teeth. Every time I looked up, he was watching me. He didn't look at the wound, and he didn't look at the police lights still flickering against the ceiling. He looked only at me. It was an unnerving, dominant stare that made my skin prickle with heat. It felt as though he was cataloging my every move, memorizing the way my hair fell over my shoulder or the way my hands trembled as I threaded the needle. "Why?" he asked, his voice a low vibration that I felt in my chest. "Why help a man you know is a monster?" I didn't look up from the stitches I was carefully placing. "Because monsters don't bleed this much," I replied softly. "And because no one should have to die alone in the rain." A faint, ghost of a smirk touched his lips, gone as quickly as it appeared. He leaned back, his body finally beginning to relax as the pain dulled, yet he never once closed his eyes. By the time I tied off the last stitch, the sun was beginning to bleed through the gray clouds outside. I stood back, exhausted and covered in his blood, thinking the worst was over. But Rico just looked at the door, his expression hardening into a mask of cold steel. "The dead is recorded, Lily Parker," he murmured. "But the morning always brings the bill." I didn't mean to fall asleep. I had slumped into the armchair across from the sofa where I'd left Rico, my mind a frayed wire after hours of adrenaline and the rhythmic, terrifying sound of his breathing. When I finally drifted off, it was into a dream of rain and iron. I woke to a silence so profound it felt heavy. The usual morning sounds of the heights, the distant rumble of the garbage truck, the shouting of neighbors, the chirping of birds, had been surgically removed from the world. The air in my apartment felt pressurized, vibrating with a tension I couldn't explain. I sat up, my neck stiff, and glanced at the sofa. It was empty. The bloody towels were gone, the surface wiped clean with a precision that made my heart skip. My first thought was that he had vanished like a ghost into the night, leaving me with nothing but a stained kitchen table and a memory of ice-blue eyes. Rubbing the sleep from my face, I stood up and walked toward the front window, drawing back the lace curtain just a fraction of an inch. The sight made the breath hitch in my throat. My street, a narrow vein of cracked pavement and aging brick, had been transformed into a fortress. Row after row of black, armored SUVs sat idling in the dawn light, their engines emitting a low, predatory hum that rattled my window panes. I counted 10, then 20, then stopped as the line disappeared around the corner. They were sleek, window-tinted beasts, forming a seamless, impenetrable wall of steel and glass around my modest home. Men stood at regular intervals between the vehicles. They weren't wearing the suits I'd seen in movies, these men were in full tactical gear, their faces obscured by shadows, their hands resting with practiced ease on weapons that looked far too heavy for a Tuesday morning. There was no shouting, no sirens, no chaos. Just a silent, overwhelming display of power that had claimed my entire block. The neighborhood was a ghost town. No one was walking their dog. No one was opening their shutters. The world had stopped turning for everyone except the man who had occupied my living room. A soft click sounded behind me. I spun around, my back hitting the cold glass of the window. Rico stood in the doorway to my kitchen. He had swapped his ruined white shirt for a fresh black one that made him look like part of the shadow itself. He looked stronger than he had any right to be, his presence filling the small room until it felt like a cage. He held a cup of my coffee in his hand, the steam curling around his sharp features. "Good morning, Lily," he said, his voice as smooth and terrifying as the fleet of vehicles outside. What is this? I gestured wildly at the window, my voice barely a whisper. He took a slow, deliberate sip of the coffee, his eyes never leaving mine. "This is the consequence of your mercy," he replied. "My enemies know I survived. They know where I sought refuge. And since I am a man who protects his investments, you are now the most well-guarded woman in this city." I looked back at the iron wall outside, then at the man in my kitchen. The quiet life I had built to hide from the world hadn't just been interrupted, it had been demolished. The silence of the room was punctured by a sharp, rhythmic knock on the front door, two heavy thuds that sounded more like a summons than a request. Rico didn't move to answer it. He simply adjusted his gold chain and leaned against my kitchen counter, his eyes fixed on me as if anticipating my reaction. The door opened before I could even find my voice. Two men stepped inside, their presence instantly making my small living room feel claustrophobic. They moved with a synchronized, predatory efficiency that reminded me of the SUVs outside. The first, whom I would come to know as Luca, was older, with silver-dusted hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Behind him was Aaron, younger and leaner, with a restless energy and eyes that scanned the room for threats with mechanical precision. They didn't look at the decor or the books on my shelves. They looked at Rico first, bowing their heads in a brief, silent acknowledgement of his authority, then turned their focus entirely on me. "Is this her?" Luca asked, his voice a gravelly baritone. Rico gave a single, shallow nod. "Lily Parker. She's the reason I'm standing." The two men approached me. I instinctively took a step back, my hip hitting the edge of the wooden table where I had stitched Rico's skin just hours before. Luca stopped exactly 3 feet away, maintaining a distance that felt both respectful and deeply threatening. He didn't offer a smile. Instead, he looked at me with a clinical coldness, as if he were assessing a high-value asset rather than a human being. "Miss Parker," Luca said, his tone devoid of warmth but heavy with a strange, formal courtesy. "I am Luca, and this is Aaron. We represent the interests of the Vale family. From this moment forward, your safety is our primary directive. Your life as you knew it has been suspended." "Suspended?" I found my voice, though it sounded thin and brittle. "I have a job. I have friends. You can't just—" "You have a target on your back," Aaron interrupted, his voice sharp and impatient. He was already checking the locks on my windows, his movements blurred by speed. "Dante Cross does not leave loose ends. Anyone who touches the boss becomes a part of the war. By saving him, you signed a contract you didn't know existed." Luca stepped closer, handing me a sleek, encrypted phone that felt cold in my palm. "You are now under the protection of the Vale family. Every exit is covered. Every breath you take is monitored. You will not leave this house without an escort, and you will not contact anyone from your previous life until we deem it safe." It wasn't an offer. It was a declaration of ownership. I looked at Rico, hoping for some spark of the vulnerability I'd seen in the rain, but he only watched me with those ice-blue eyes, silent and unyielding. The gentle, cream-sweater life I had curated was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of a family I didn't choose and a war I wasn't prepared to fight. Rico set the coffee mug down on my counter with a click that sounded like a gavel. He moved toward me, his presence reclaiming the room from his lieutenants. Luca and Aaron stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, leaving us in a heavy, charged pocket of air. He stopped just inches away, tall enough that I had to tilt my head back, exposing the pulse point in my neck that was fluttering like a trapped moth. "You look like you're waiting for an apology, Lily," he said, his voice dropping into that smooth, whiskey gravel register. But I don't apologize for survival. I do, however, settle my accounts. He reached into the inner pocket of his fresh jacket and pulled out a thick envelope, sliding it across the table where I had stitched his skin back together. The student loans that have been keeping you awake at night? Paid. The back rent you were terrified to mention to your landlord? Covered. I even took the liberty of purchasing this building. You no longer have a landlord. You have me. I stared at the envelope, then back at him, a cold sensation spreading through my limbs. It wasn't a gift, it was a tether. I didn't do it for money, Rico. I did it because you were dying. I know why you did it, he countered, his gaze softening just a fraction, a brief glimpse of the man who had bled out in my kitchen. But mercy has a high price in my world. Dante Cross, the man who sent the hit squad last night, is not a man of grand gestures. He is a man of details. One of his scouts saw you pull me from that alley. They didn't just see a girl in a cream sweater, they saw a weakness. They have your name, your history, and your face. The room seemed to tilt. The innocence I had used as a shield felt paper thin. I had spent years trying to be invisible, trying to stay safe in my lavender-scented bubble, only to have the most dangerous man in the city drag me into the spotlight. What does that mean? I whispered. Rico reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a touch that was unexpectedly tender, yet firm. It means you are no longer a bystander. In Dante's eyes, you are an accomplice. He will come for you to get to me, or simply to see if I'm capable of feeling enough to save you. You can't go back to your quiet life, Lily. That life ended the moment you touched my blood. He leaned in closer, his scent, expensive tobacco and something cold like rain, filling my senses. I have wiped your debts to the world, but you have gained a new one to me. I will keep you alive, but you will stay where I can see you. That is the complication. That is the price of your mercy. The heavy, metallic scent of the armored fleet outside seemed to seep through the floorboards, poisoning the lavender air of my home. I was staring at the envelope on the table, my mind reeling from Rico's declaration of ownership, when the front door burst open again. Aaron strode in, his face pale and his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. He didn't look at me, his eyes went straight to Rico. "Boss," Aaron said, his voice tight. Dante made a move. He didn't go for the perimeter. Rico's hand dropped from my jaw, the warmth of his touch replaced by a sudden, biting chill. "Speak," he commanded, his voice dropping an octave into something primal. He picked up two girls leaving the cafe on 4th Street. Clara Miller and Lena Vance. Aaron held up a tablet, the screen flickering with a grainy surveillance image of a black van with sliding doors. They were taken 10 minutes ago. Cross left a message on the curb. A single cream-colored ribbon soaked in gasoline. The world tilted on its axis. The tea I'd sipped earlier felt like lead in my stomach. Clara. Lena. My only friends in this city, the women who had dragged me out for coffee when I was drowning in my own silence, who knew nothing of bullets or gold chains or blood-stained white shirts. They were innocent. They were my last tether to a life that made sense. "No," I whispered, the word catching in my throat. I lunged toward Aaron, reaching for the tablet, but Luca's hand appeared from the shadows, stopping me with a grip that was firm but not unkind. "You have to help them. They don't know anything. They have nothing to do with this." Rico turned to me, his expression a mask of cold, calculated iron. The vulnerability I had seen in his kitchen was gone, buried under layers of Mafia sovereignty. "That is exactly why he took them, Lily. He is showing you that there is no outside anymore. He is burning the bridges back to your old life so that you have nowhere to go but toward me. You did this, I spat, tears of rage and terror blurring my vision. Your war, your blood. They're just collateral to you, aren't they? Rico stepped into my space, his shadow looming over me. To him, yes. To me, they are a breach of my territory. He looked at Aaron. Tell the men to mobilize. I want every SUV on the street moving toward the docks. If a hair on their heads is touched, I want Dante's head on a silver tray. As the house erupted into a frenzy of tactical preparation, the clicking of safeties, the barking of orders over radios, I sank into my chair. I looked down at my hands, still faintly stained with the antiseptic I'd used on Rico's skin. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't go back to the bookstore. I couldn't meet Clara for brunch. My quiet sanctuary had become a command center, and my innocence had been traded for a seat at a table made of bone and steel. My life wasn't just suspended, it was extinct. The house had been stripped of its domesticity, replaced by a cold, operational hum. As the sun reached its zenith, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors, Rico found me sitting by the window, staring at the armored wall outside. He didn't offer comfort. Instead, he dropped a heavy, cold piece of polymer and steel onto the kitchen table. It made a dull thud that sounded like a final nail in a coffin. I won't always be in the room, Lily, he said, his voice stripping away the last of my illusions. And Dante has proven that he doesn't care about the rules of your world. If they get past my men, you can't be a lamb waiting for the slaughter. I looked at the weapon with a mixture of revulsion and dread. I've spent my life trying to stay away from things like this. I'm not a killer, Rico. No, he said, stepping behind me. You're a survivor. I saw it in the rain. Most people would have run, but you stayed. You have the instinct, you just lack the tools. He reached around me, his large, warm hands covering mine. He guided my fingers toward the grip. The contrast was stark, my pale, trembling hand tucked beneath his scarred, steady palm. His chest was a solid wall against my back, and for a moment, the terror of the weapon was eclipsed by the sheer, overwhelming presence of the man holding me. Firm, but don't choke it, he murmured, his breath ghosting against my ear. The weight is your friend. Respect it, but don't fear it. As he adjusted my stance, his touch lingered on my shoulders, and I felt a shift in the air. The dominance was still there, but it was layered with something softer, a recognition that went beyond the tactical. He turned me slightly, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that made me forget to breathe. You think you're the only one who wanted a quiet life? He asked softly, his voice losing its jagged edge. I see the way you look at the world, Lily. You're hiding from a ghost. I recognize the look because I've carried mine for a long time. In that moment, the predator vanished. I saw the shared wounds behind his ice blue gaze, the scars that weren't on his skin, but etched into his soul. It was a moment of unexpected tenderness, a bridge built between a girl in a cream sweater and a man who ruled with blood. He wasn't just teaching me to shoot, he was acknowledging that we were both casualties of a world that refused to leave us alone. He squeezed my hand once, a silent promise, before his mask of iron returned. Again, he commanded. Until your hands stop shaking. Until you're ready. The stillness of the evening was a lie. It was a thick, artificial silence that felt like a wire being stretched to the snapping point. Rico had moved to the back of the house to take a secure call, leaving me in the living room with the cold weight of the weapon he'd given me resting on the coffee table. I was staring at it, wondering if I would ever have the courage to use it, when the light in the hallway flickered and died. A soft, wet thud echoed from the porch, the sound of a body hitting wood. My heart stopped. I didn't reach for the light switch, I reached for the steel. The front door didn't burst open, it eased on its hinges with a terrifying, practiced silence. A shadow detached itself from the darkness of the porch, a man in a gray tactical vest, his face obscured by a skullprint mask. It was Raymond, Dante's primary enforcer, a man whose reputation for cruelty was whispered even in the quietest corners of the Heights. He stepped into my sanctuary, a silenced pistol raised, his eyes scanning the room with the hunger of a wolf. "Where is he, little lamb?" he hissed, his voice a jagged edge in the dark. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was frozen. But I didn't have to. The night outside exploded. What I thought were the idling engines of the SUV fleet suddenly roared into a deafening, synchronized growl. The iron wall didn't just stand guard, it moved. Powerful spotlights mounted on the roofs of the vehicles ignited at once, lancing through my windows with a blinding, white-hot intensity that turned the living room into a theater of silhouettes. Raymond flinched, shielded his eyes, and that was the only opening Rico needed. He appeared from the shadows of the kitchen like a vengeful god, his own weapon roaring before Raymond could adjust. The glass of my front door shattered inward as Rico's men, Luca and Aaron leading the charge, breached the perimeter. Outside, the neighborhood was no longer a ghost town, it was a war zone. The 50 armored SUVs had pivoted, forming a mobile fortress that blocked both ends of the street. I watched through the jagged remains of my window as Dante's secondary hit squad was swallowed by the overwhelming force of the Vale army. It wasn't a fight, it was an execution. Rico's men moved with a terrifying, clinical precision, their tactical gear gleaming under the strobing lights of the SUVs. Rico stood over Raymond's fallen form, his face illuminated by the harsh white glare from the street. He didn't look at the carnage outside. He looked at me, checking for blood that wasn't his. "The walls held, Lily," he said, his voice a low vibration against the backdrop of gunfire and screeching tires. I looked at the shattered remains of my home, at the army that had turned my street into a graveyard to keep me safe. The innocent girl who had found a stranger in the rain was gone. In her place was someone who understood that in this world, protection wasn't a gift, it was a cage of iron and fire. The smoke from the skirmish still hung in the damp night air when the black SUVs began to pivot, their headlights cutting through the haze like searchlights. Rico didn't wait for the cleanup crew to finish. He stood in the center of my ruined living room, checking the slide of his weapon with a detached, lethal calmness. He looked at the shattered window, then at me, and I saw the shift in his eyes. The predator was going on the hunt. "Dante has Clara and Lena at the industrial pier," he said, his voice flat and final. "He wants a negotiation. I'm going to give him an ending." "You're going alone?" I asked, the fear finally breaking through the numbness. "I'm going with an army," he replied, gesturing to the wall of iron outside. "But I'm the only one who can walk into that room. Stay with Luca. Do not leave the perimeter." I watched from the porch as his lead vehicle tore away, followed by a rhythmic procession of steel. The silence that followed was worse than the gunfire. Luca escorted me not back into my house, but to a secure high-security estate on the outskirts of the city, a place of marble, glass, and silent guards. As the hours stretched into the deep, hollow parts of the night, I paced the length of a room that felt like a gilded cage. Every time a phone buzzed or a car door slammed in the distance, my heart jolted. I found myself staring at the cream sweater I was still wearing, now smudged with soot and Rico's dried blood. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't just afraid for Clara and Lena. I was terrified for him. For years, I had built my life around the idea of safety, convinced that if I just stayed quiet enough and small enough, nothing could hurt me. But sitting in this fortress, I realized that the safe life I'd lived was just a slow way of dying. Rico had brought danger, yes, but he had also brought light. He had seen the wounds I tried to hide and hadn't looked away. I looked at the clock, 3 a.m. The silence of the mansion was suffocating. I realized then that I wasn't afraid of the SUVs, the weapons, or the dark secrets of the Vale family. I was afraid of the silence returning. I was afraid of going back to a world where I didn't have to worry about a man like Rico Vale, because a world without him was a world back in the gray. I didn't want my sanctuary anymore. I wanted the man who had bled on my floor. I wanted the danger, because for the first time in a long time, the danger made me feel alive. I sat by the window, my eyes fixed on the long, winding driveway, praying for the flicker of headlights to break the dark. The first hint of dawn was a pale, bruised purple against the horizon when the sound of heavy engines finally broke the silence of the estate. I didn't wait for an escort. I ran to the foyer, my breath hitching as the massive front doors groaned open. A single black SUV pulled into the gravel circle, its frame spattered with mud and the grime of a long, violent night. Rico stepped out before the vehicle had fully stopped. He looked weary, his black shirt dusted with debris, but he was whole. Behind him, another car opened, and I sobbed with relief as Clara and Lena emerged, shaken and tearful, but guided gently toward the guest wing by Aaron's men. Rico didn't follow them. He kept his eyes on me, walking with a slow, deliberate pace until he stood in the center of the hall. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys, holding them out in the palm of his hand. They glinted under the crystal chandelier. "The thread is gone, Lily," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. "Dante Cross won't be coming for you again. Clara and Lena are safe, and their families are being taken care of as we speak." I looked at the keys, then up at his face. The cold, iron mask was still there, but beneath it, I saw an invitation, one that terrified me more than the gunman in the night. "There is a car waiting at the gates," Rico continued, his gaze unyielding. "It can take you back to your apartment. It can take you to a new city, a new name, a new life. I told you I would settle my accounts. You are free. No more SUVs, no more tactical gear, no more shadows." I looked down at myself. I was still wearing that simple cream sweater, though it was now a map of everything I had been through, stained with his blood, smelling of smoke and the cold rain of the heights. It represented the girl I used to be, the one who lived a quiet, half-life of safety and silence. Then I looked at Rico. I looked at the man who had seen my fear and taught me to hold a weapon, the man who had moved an army to protect my peace. I realized that the apartment in the Heights wasn't a home anymore, it was just a place where I had been waiting to disappear. I spent a long time hiding from the world because I was afraid of getting hurt again, I whispered, my voice growing stronger as I took a step toward him. But that quiet life, it was just a different kind of prison. I didn't take the keys. Instead, I reached out and placed my hand over his, pushing the keys back toward his chest. "I'm not going back to the gray, Rico," I said, a sudden, vivid warmth blooming in my chest. "I don't want a life where I never have to look over my shoulder. I want the life that makes me feel like I'm finally awake." A slow, rare smile touched his lips, not the smirk of a predator, but the look of a man who had finally found what he was searching for in the rain. He closed his fingers around mine, pulling me into the shadow of his protection. The door to my past closed with a soft, final click, and together, we walked toward a future that was vivid, dangerous, and for the first time in years, entirely mine. What an incredible journey we've just taken with Lily and Rico. From a rainy alleyway to the heart of a mafia empire, this story is about more than just danger, it's about the moment we decide to stop hiding and start living. Now, I want to turn the spotlight on you. Stories like this work because they force us to ask ourselves the what-if questions. So, let's dive into a few things that made Lily's journey so gripping. If you were in Lily's shoes that rainy night, would you have opened your door? What's your take? I'd love to hear your thoughts on these characters. Who was your favorite? Was it the stoic power of Rico, the quiet strength of Lily, or perhaps the clinical loyalty of Luca and Aaron? Drop a comment and let me know, what would you have done if 50 armored SUVs surrounded your house tomorrow morning? Thank you for staying with me till this moment, and if you'd like to support me, kindly like, comment and subscribe to the channel as means a lot to me. Till next time. Bye.